the name of our organization, all spelled out, historicsaranac.org. So if you want to get your email ready with your questions for our speakers, that's great. Okay, and I think it's a little bit after 6. Are we ready to get started? Brad and Jim?
Yep.
Okay, super. Well, let me just do a quick introduction here to get us started. Welcome everybody to our last of our 3 speaker series that we've had commemorating the 50th anniversary of the APA. I'm Amy Catania. I'm the executive director here at Historic Saranac Lake. I'm here at the Saranac Laboratory Museum. If you haven't come to visit us, please do. We're open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 5. We have a new exhibit that we're opening next week. All sorts of great things going on. So be sure to come by and visit us here. We thought of this speaker series, well, because we found out about Brad's book and we said, well, that's something everybody's going to be interested in. And we're also in the process of expanding our museum to the Trudeau building next door. We're going to become a 2-building museum campus that really tells a little bit broader of a story than we have had the space to do here at the Laboratory Museum. So in preparation for that, we're learning ourselves and meeting folks that know more than we do about different topics. And so we're really interested in looking at history of the Saranac Lake region, before Dr. Trudeau and after Dr. Trudeau, and of course during Dr. Trudeau's time. So the first of our speaker series was with Melissa Otis, who wrote a fascinating book called Rural Indigenousness, and we had a talk with her and Yagoni Gonliosta, who is the in charge of the museum. She's the museum program coordinator at the Akwesasne Cultural Center. And then a couple weeks ago, we had a talk with Phil Terry and my friend Ann Norton Green, and that was a great discussion about Phil's book, Contested Terrain. So now we have our last one with Brad Edmondson about his new book, A Wild Idea. And thank you, Jim Hotaling, for being here to keep the conversation moving. I knew that you could help me do that. So let me introduce our 2 speakers. Brad Edmondson is an award-winning journalist and consultant who covers social change and how it happens. He's the author of Post-War Cornell and Ice Cream Social. Brad was co-founder of epodunk.com from 1999 to 2007 and the editor-in-chief of American Demographics magazine 1985 to 1998. Jim Hotaling is helping with the discussion today, and he's a retired architect and planner with 50+ year background in private and public work. He was head of local government services at the APA for 26 years, up to 2003, and he provided help to communities in planning and development and implementation of land use regulations. Most importantly, Jim is the husband of the woman who helped start all of this at Historic Saranac Lake, my colleague, Mary Hotaling, who knows more than Jim about just about everything. Just kidding, Jim.
No, that's good.
It's true. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jim, to Brad.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. And thank you all for logging in. I feel like I'm really on the spot here speaking to Historic Saranac Lake. It's an honor. And I recognize a lot of the people who are watching. I've spoken to during the course of this research. John Ernst, hello. Margie Amadeo, my great assistant down at the Kelly Adirondack Research Center, is here. Bob Glennon, of course, is on the call. Bob, I think you were on last night as well. And I think Liz Thorndike is also on the call. I'm honored that you all phoned in, and also I really got to be on my game today because a lot of people who are watching this, I think, lived through the events that I wrote about. I want to tell you just a couple of minutes about the project in general and some of my general conclusions after publishing the book. Then we're going to show a preview of a documentary that we're putting together that's going to air in October on Mountain Lake PBS based on the book. And then Jim and I are going to talk for a while, and then hopefully we'll have some some time for questions from all of you. But I live here in downstate in Ithaca, but I feel not exactly like a resident of Saranac Lake, but somebody who at least knows the town pretty well. I started this project in 2002, and I got a small grant to go do oral history interviews with the people who set up the Adirondack Park Agency. And the first person I interviewed was Clarence Petty. And that was really a lucky guess, because by the time I finished talking to Clarence for 12 hours, I was completely hooked on this story. And the original idea was to just capture the sort of testimonies of the people who set up the APA, and keep them on tape and archive them. So I went after, in addition to Clarence, I also spoke with Gary Randorf, Arthur Crocker, David Newhouse, many of the people who are no longer with us, in addition to many APA staffers, including Jim. Jim Hotaling was one of the last people I interviewed during the oral history phase of the project. Also talked to Gary Dupre a couple of months ago, and as well as Bob Glennon. But as the oral history proceeded there over a 5 or 6 year period, I got more and more interested in the opposition to the APA for several reasons. One of which was that I began to see that the lead up to the Adirondack Park Agency had a really good, very well curated paper trail, a lot of minutes, a lot of documents. It wasn't going to be hard to tell that story. However, the opposition to the APA had left almost nothing behind. So I started going and talking to the people who had fought the APA. So I went and I interviewed Frank Cashier. I didn't find Glenn Harris in time, but I interviewed Bev Sawaya Harris, Andy Halloran, and others to try to get a sense of why the APA was so unpopular from the get-go, and why the opposition was so determined for such a long time, and to sort of give the other side of the story its due. And I assume that most of you, given the audience, most of you know the basic outlines of this story, but for the benefit of those of you who don't, I'll give you just a thumbnail sketch of it. The story kind of started in 1967 when the interstate highway, the Northway, opened. It ran up the eastern side of the park, drastically cutting the amount of time that it took to get to the Adirondacks from New York and other big cities. And there was a lot of development pressure on the Adirondacks. A lot of developers had proposed big second home projects, and there was very little control on what could be done on the private land in the Adirondacks at that time. So there was a feeling among state planners and environmentalists that something needed to be done to keep these large second home developments out of the Adirondacks. The first volley was really when Nelson Rockefeller's brother Lawrence, sort of out of nowhere, proposed that the Adirondacks become a national park. This was straight out of Lawrence Rockefeller's playbook. He'd been making national parks all his life, so he just thought maybe it would be a good idea to make another one. The idea was dead in the water. It never took off. Everybody hated Lawrence's idea, but it gave him a chance to make the case that we better do something about this, or the Adirondacks is going to turn into southern Vermont, the Wisconsin Dells, Arizona, the west coast of Florida, all of these places where large blocks of rural land were getting carved up into tiny little house lots and sold piecemeal to people from far away, which was creating planning nightmares in all kinds of rural communities. So it kind of got the ball rolling, and Nelson's, he was Nelson's younger brother and also his best friend. So to sort of save face and keep the discussion going, Nelson appointed 11 sort of members of the Republican establishment, and some Democrats as well, to the Temporary Study Commission on the Future of the Adirondacks, which ran from 1968 to the end of the year in 1970. And that's a big, long story in itself of what happened there. involving a fight between Lawrence Rockefeller and the chairman, Harold Hochschild, a tremendous amount of really groundbreaking scientific research and natural resources management that took place then, and a whole lot of field trips and camping out and surveying the forest preserve and also the private lands of the Adirondacks. So anyway, that report was released in right at the beginning of 1971. And it had 181 recommendations, a very broad range of recommendations of how to essentially save the Adirondack Park. They were ranked, and recommendation number one was create a state agency that would have a great deal of authority over all of the land inside the blue line, the private land and the public land inside the blue line. Well, that was the only recommendation that got turned into law in 1971, and that was the creation of the Adirondack Park Agency. And we'll get into this later, but it really was a terrific piece of timing that the legislation was proposed when it was, and it really, I don't think, could have been enacted at any other time because the environmental movement was absolutely at its peak. Nelson Rockefeller was still at the peak of his power, and the people inside the Adirondack Park were vastly outnumbered by the environmentalists across the state who really wanted this agency to happen. So the agency is signed into law in June of 1971, and Richard Lawrence is named the chair of the board of the agency. And he reaches back to the Temporary Study Commission and gets this 30-year-old guy who, until the Temporary Study Commission was formed, was an ex-forest ranger and a guy who'd enrolled at Cornell University as a graduate student and was at Cornell for all of 6 weeks before he came to work for the Temporary Study Commission, a guy named George Davis. And George wanted to get a PhD studying the question of how to balance human activity and the natural integrity of ecosystems inside the blue line. And he was hired to essentially investigate that problem and recommend ways to accomplish it and to have a state salary and benefits at the same time. So he naturally took the job. So September of 1971, George Davis is employee number one of the Adirondack Park Agency, and he gets some spare real estate that the Department of Environmental Conservation was planning to burn down, a log cabin, it's still there. They say, okay, APA, you can use it. And George gets the key, opens the door, he walks in. There's nothing in there. There's nobody in there. There's no instructions. He doesn't have any guidance. So the first thing that George does on his first day of work is he goes and he gets from the DEC, finds out that you can buy things in town with something called a purchase order. So he gets a purchase order and he goes into town and he buys 2 big crates of toilet paper. And he brings them back to the office and he uses one of the crates of toilet paper for his chair and he uses the other crate for his desk. And he puts his phone on the one that he's using for his desk and the coffee pot as well. And that's the beginning of the Adirondack Park Agency. This is kind of amusing until you consider that George had about 14 to 16 months before he had to submit 2 plans. One was a master plan for 2.5 million acres of state-owned land. And the other was a master plan for 3-point-something million acres of privately owned land inside the blue line to prevent detractions of development in the park. He was all alone. He had 14 months to do this. There was also a budget crisis at the time. And so the budget of the APA was just ridiculously small. And to make matters really comical, Nelson Rockefeller by that time had decided to abandon the New York State governorship to run for president for the 4th time. So the main man behind the Adirondack Park Agency was leaving the governor's post. And here was George all by himself. George wasn't daunted at all because he was 30 years old. He was essentially a graduate student and he was going to save the Adirondack Park. So he pulled together this team of people who were very brilliant, very committed to environmental protection, and extremely hardworking. And they did it. In 14 months, they submitted these 2 plans. And they were working very hard, working under the gun, pulling all-nighters. And they've got the plan out to public comment with just barely enough time to circulate it for public comment before they had to submit it to the legislature, which meant that they didn't really talk to local people very much about what they were doing. And what they proposed, as you know from living in the park, was a pretty restrictive land use plan for the private land in the park. And they sort of dropped this on the people of the Adirondacks on December 22nd, 1970, with no warning. And it was kind of like throwing a lit match into a puddle of gasoline. So the first half of 1973, the private land plan was submitted to the legislature, and during a series of public hearings, the local people got to express their displeasure, which they did in fairly vehement terms. But then they also submitted lots of requests for revisions to the plan. The plan was revised, and really the outcome wasn't all that much in doubt because the environmental community had organized so well statewide that they exerted overwhelming pressure on the legislature to pass the plan, and the plan was passed in May of 1973. And that sort of truly made the Adirondacks into a park because it gave a framework for the management of the land to keep it park-like. That's the basic outline of the story. Before we show you the teaser that kind of, puts all this into 4 minutes for a television audience, at the end of the whole process, I sort of had two main takeaways from the story. One was, this could not happen again in the way it happened. The world in 1970-71 was simply too different in too many ways from the world today. And one of the big differences was that ordinary Americans had a lot more faith in the government to solve problems than they do now, and a lot more faith in sort of top-down government solutions. And that was only one of the reasons why the law was able to pass and why nothing like it could be done today. But the other takeaway was sort of paradoxical because, the Adirondacks is increasingly now being pointed to as an example of a carbon storehouse for the control of climate change. And environmental figures all over the world are saying that we need to protect and enhance large unbroken forests in order to create carbon sinks to mitigate the effects of global warming. And so even though nothing like the Adirondack Park Agency could be created in the same way today, it's also true that we have to figure out a way to do landscape level conservation on a massive scale and do it globally if we're going to control the effects of climate change. So those were the two big thoughts in my head as I submitted this book. So now we're going to show you the teaser that we're working on. Paul Frederick and I are putting this movie together. It's going to air on Mountain Lake PBS in October, and then Jim's going to ask me some questions.
Grand Canyon and Great Smokies National Parks combined. It is one of the largest unbroken deciduous forests on Earth. It has 1,000 miles of wild and scenic rivers and hundreds of crystal clear lakes and lofty peaks. But here is an even more amazing thing about the Adirondack Park. Most of its land is privately owned, and 85 million people live within a day's drive. Yet the Adirondacks seem almost completely undeveloped. How did that happen?
In the story of land use planning in the United States, the Adirondack Park Agency is truly significant. What it was doing at that time it was on the frontier of land use planning.
The Adirondack Park Agency was a wild idea when it was created 50 years ago. It owes its existence to several big trends that combined to create an irresistible force. After World War II, a small group of activists spent more than 2 decades building the case that the Adirondacks needed to be protected from development. By 1968, they had overwhelming public support. The activists pressured Governor Nelson Rockefeller to act. Rocky set up a commission that studied the Adirondacks for 2 years before issuing 181 recommendations that were, in a word, bold. Many of them had never been tried before, and despite the risks, Rockefeller eagerly supported the activists' cause.
You know, he believed in big things. He was not a small man in any sense of the word. It wouldn't have happened without him. There's no question about it.
Rockefeller strong-armed state lawmakers into passing the bill that created the Adirondack Park Agency, or APA. He ordered the agency to write 2 master plans for all the land in the park, a territory the size of the state of Vermont, and to deliver them in less than 2 years. Nothing like that had ever been done before. The APA's young staff was brilliant, passionate about protecting the park, and extremely hardworking. The plans they produced were revolutionary, but they lacked 2 critical things: money and time.
We were given a very, very tight deadline and a very low budget. I mean, the budget was just ridiculous.
The APA also did not try very hard to explain its tough new regulations to local landowners, even though zoning laws had been almost entirely unknown in the Adirondacks. The activists were so focused on saving land, they didn't think about the 100,000 people who lived in the park, and many of those people were outraged.
I don't think it ever occurred to me or anyone that I was working with that maybe the local people might have a very different attitude about this plan to create a state agency. It just didn't occur to us at the time, just didn't occur.
Over its first 50 years, the Adirondack Park Agency has been praised and studied as a triumph of land use planning. Today, the urgent need to control climate change depends on preserving and restoring large forests. New York did that in a big way 50 years ago. The wide open spaces of the Adirondacks are now recognized as a global treasure.
This is a big, wild area in a highly populated state where we have found a way to reasonably balance the protection of nature and the rights of people to live there. And I think the lessons from the Adirondacks are actually globally important.
But a lot of people who live inside the park disagree with this view. Even after 50 years, they still think the agency and its restrictions on private land development are un-American. They say private property is private, and the Adirondacks don't need more wilderness as much as it needs better jobs.
The agency has convinced people by repeating this untruth over and over again that this is the largest park in the United States. They call all of the land inside of this blue land a park, which is not true. 60% of that land is privately owned. No privately owned land is part of a state park. In other words, they have taken the theory that Hitler practiced. If you tell a lie often enough, you will soon become believed, and it will be a fact.
It's an endless debate that boils down to a basic question. What is wildland worth?
Go back wherever you come from, but get out of here.
And next time they're going to see him with deer rifles, then they better have another thought about this, because we are deadly serious about defending our rights.
So there you have it.
Thank you, Brad. That was that's a great taste of what your next exciting project. So thank you for sharing that. I'm gonna, before we head into another part of the conversation here, I just want to mention to everybody, if you have some questions or comments that you'd like to share and see if we can address at the end, if you would like to email those to me, that would be the best thing. I'm sorry I accidentally disabled the chat feature, so you can send me an email with your question or comment to Amy, A-M-Y, at historicsaranac.lake.org. Okay, and with that, I think we'll hand it over to you, Jim.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Good, okay. First of all, thanks to Brad and thanks to everybody that worked on that. So many people in that trailer I recognize, obviously Frank, who lived up the street from us for a number of years. But I think what's interesting about this is the breadth of people that were involved. I got about 6 or 7 questions, and Amy, if someone comes in with a question that relates to what I asked, bring that up, because they may have a different take on it, if you would. I guess, Brad, the first question I'm thinking of, and you sort of started to answer this. This was a question actually provided to me by Rich Thibodeau, who was a planner for the agency years ago. He went to head the Department of Water Resources in Massachusetts. And a lot of people that used to work at the agency came to different places. Jack Mills went off to head BLM in Desert, California. And people from the Adirondacks, because of the agency, I think, went to environmental careers in other parts of the country. But my question was, what lessons did you learn from this research and the writing that could still be applied? And what would you change? I guess that's a basic question. I know you started to answer that, but I wonder if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, you mean what would I change in my own research, or
yeah,
what would I have changed in my own research? Oh, well, I would have gone right after Ron Stafford, for one thing. By the time I got around to approaching Ron Stafford, he was too sick to talk to me, and he was one who got away. Several of the key players I didn't get to talk to. So one of the things I would change was the order in which I talked to people.
Yeah.
But the to your other question of the APA alumni going on to important planning duties in other places, I think that's an interesting point, and it really points to the stature, the high stature that the APA has held within the planning community. If you have APA on your resume within the planning community, you've got a pretty good you've got a pretty good mark there on your resume. And I think one of the reasons for that was that almost alone among regional planning schemes, the APA was given legislative authority to actually enforce the plan.
Yeah.
Planning schemes in other states more or less relied on voluntary agreements with localities in most cases, with a few exceptions. But the APA was really very, very different in that it gave a state agency a lot of authority over 6 million acres. And the way it turned out, as you better than almost anyone else know, Jim, is that the APA became more like a sort of like a board of zoning appeals for an area the size of the state of Vermont. And so that's, I think, why so many alumni went on to positions of prominence.
Yeah, I think that what I call, and maybe Paul Herman might correct me there, is that the states enable towns to do zoning in the first instance all over the US. And the state was literally holding on to that enabling authority to zone, if you will, the Adirondacks. That's always been my overly simplistic view of how legally it's constructed.
I think that's right.
Yeah, and it's an important aspect, probably true in almost any state. I'm not sure, but I don't know of any state that doesn't enable its local governments to zone. But yeah, so that, I don't know what else to ask about that question. My sense, go ahead.
No, one thing I was going to interject there, which to the point that you just made, was that I think you're correct in a legal sense that the state enables localities to control their own land use, and it withheld that authority within the Adirondack Park in a law that was passed in 1912. However, virtually nobody inside the Adirondack Park knew that in the early 1970s. And
I
so,
tried to tell them.
yeah, you tried to tell them, yeah, right. Well, I was really talking about before the law was signed. You know, everybody I talked to said, you know, I knew that this was being discussed in Albany, but I figured that we were going to have control over our own land use because of home rule, because that was a constitutional principle in New York. Nobody had told them that home rule didn't apply in the Adirondacks. And that was one of the reasons why it came as such a shock to the people inside the Blue Line.
Yeah, it's really it's so unique. On the other hand, it's so basic. It's really interesting how that it's sort of hidden. I guess in my experience, my sense of talking to several local officials, in private, they were ambivalent or even open about toward the agency. That may be because I got here late. You know, I was in Saratoga, moved west, got educated, and came back from exploding Denver, Colorado. Came in '77. I guess where there's a variety of opinions, when you talk to many local officials, a variety of opinions about the agency in those earlier years. You recall?
Yeah, I think that the thing that you encountered in 1977, of course, I wasn't on the scene reporting in 1970, but I saw comments from Richard Lawrence and others who said much the same thing. That Lawrence said once that he would have private meetings with town officials and present the plan to them, and they would say something to the effect of, "Oh, this sounds good. I'm glad you're doing this." And then at a public meeting that night, they would stand up and just rip the thing to shreds. And you know, if you were in their position, you might do the same thing, because the plan was so unpopular and the organization against the plan was so effective that if you were a local office holder inside the Blue Line and you didn't sort of ritually express your dead set opposition to the APA, you were not going to get reelected.
You know, when I first got hired, I guess it was April 1st. I took a state car for the first 2 weeks and drove out to see supervisors of towns who I knew were opposing the agency, at least in public. Tom Norman Sr. Charlie Keogh wasn't so much in opposition, but out to see Charlie Keogh, I think he was, not sure if he was supervisor then, but about 10 supervisors. And they couldn't figure out why I would come out alone in a car, call them up, go out alone in a car and talk with them. I just want to know what you talk, you know, what you understand to be the law, what you think about it. But it was really revealing because they were much more open they would have been in public. So it's kind of,
oh yeah.
I guess one of the questions I got from Steve Ehrman, who's on the screen right now, is that why wasn't there more of an economic balance in your view in the early deliberations of the commission and so forth? I think there was some, but I think there's always been this sense of imbalance, even though I think to some degree that the preservation of the landscape is an economic measure because it supports tourism. But you have some sort of sense about that?
That is a great question. And it's a question that, you know, when I was looking into this, you know, with 50 years hindsight, it's a question I was asking myself constantly.
Yeah.
The Temporary Study Commission, which, you know, did the first comprehensive survey of the Adirondack Park really ever, they produced 800 pages of technical reports. And their technical reports included reports on the local economy and transportation and other economic topics. But those were by far the weakest of the reports of the Temporary Study Commission. And they really did not bear down. They really did not come to any energetic conclusions about how to prop up the economy in the Adirondacks. I think there were several reasons for that. One was that really wasn't their main the main charge that the governor had given them. Originally, I think the Temporary Study Commission was pretty much focused on the forest preserve, and the idea of zoning private land came in later to the Temporary Study Commission. But it was mostly a natural resources inventory sort of exercise. It wasn't an economic development exercise. But but the other reason was that the staff of the Temporary Study Commission, led by Harold Jerry, really didn't think that that was their job. They really didn't think that it was all that important. And then later, the chair of the board of the APA, Richard Lawrence, also felt like that was not really all that important for the APA, and that the local people should be left to fend for themselves. I think in retrospect, that was the biggest failing that the early agency had. And now I think in the conservation movement, it's generally understood that you cannot effectively preserve a region if you're doing landscape level conservation if you don't have the support of the people who live there.
Yeah, we did have an element of economic analysis in all the local planning programs as part of our sort of phase one analysis.
Yes.
And I think Dick Lawrence and others, I think as Steve Ehrman has told me, came to him and said, you know, it's one of our failings. I think that was the mid 80s, I believe. But that is one of the big things that sort of stands out in everyone's mind, probably well into today. From every local program that we assisted, which is about 90 over the years, we had an economic analysis element. Did not have much in terms of regional strength. So you would invent these typical terms like light, we want light industry, we want blah, 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 you know, but it didn't get beyond much of the surface stuff. And that's one of the failings, I think, of what went on.
Yeah, it was well, but you can't really go back that far in time and judge an effort based on contemporary standards. The environmental movement was a baby when this was being done. And it was, especially environmental activists who were pushing the APA really saw themselves as being engaged in almost like a holy crusade.
I know.
And I know you know. And if you were against them, you were not on God's side. And so, there was a great deal of polarization as well. And I think a lot of self-righteousness on both sides.
Yeah, you could actually, that was in the office, you could feel that. I was there with staff that grew between 22 and maybe 35 people. One of you other guys can correct me, but that was strong in the office, that those polarities existed. And we just managed to work together and respected each other, but there were very strong differences on the staff level, which I think is frankly
interesting.
I think it's a very good thing to hire a staff like that. If you do more work in quote unquote phase two, it's one thing you might want to probe, because there were tremendous differences at the staff level, at least in the early years. One of the things that sort of the only way to describe it is geeky, but the idea of the mapping of characteristics. I want to get off the economic thing. And I studied under McCard as well as some other people at the agency, including Dick Estes and some other people, with the overlaying mapping system to do land capability. To me, that's the one thing that sort of balanced the natural environmental zeal, natural beauty. That whole thing was balanced by at least some deliberate, disciplined approach to quantifying the land. Now, you could argue forever about what you do it different ways and give different, not just a 20% screen, but whatever. I apologize if no one else knows what I'm talking about, but it's how you put together the maps on top of one another, and you end up with the most restricted category. The agency or the legislators invented principal buildings per square mile to go each of those categories. We had to reduce that to average lot size. But then within a big area, we managed to pull together, maybe stronger zoning, maybe more dense zoning near the road, and maybe like rural use might balance out to be 3 acres along the road and 12 acres out and back, which we did with a lot of programs. But I think the law was sort of overly complicated in many ways. And I don't know if you share that or not. I spent some time doing a chart. Some of you guys will recognize this. a chart which essentially, believe it or not, summarized the jurisdictional threshold for regional projects. And this got famous. People, some of the environmental people, I'm going to say this out loud, didn't like it because you actually could figure out whether you needed a permit or not. You know, there are a lot of arguments. This is, I think, in the mid '80s we did this, and I think some of the audience remembers. But it was helpful for people when I took it to a town, you know, in the same way that anything else you gave them could be useful. We used to go into the towns and give them just a simple planimetric base map of the town. They thought it was their town plan. I said, no, it's just a map of your existing roads and buildings and so forth. But
Yeah.
a connection with the communities was really needed early in the 70s, sooner than it really happened, I think, to some degree.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. Well, I think to the first part of what you said, the idea of carrying capacity, or, you know, as Ian McHarg always said, let the land tell you what it's suited for.
Yeah.
This was really the first time that concept was applied to a large region, and it was done in a big hurry. And it was done sort of on the fly with a lot of decisions being made informally and very quickly. There wasn't a great deal of documentation of how the various decisions were made about whether or not land should have restrictions. And that was a major weakness of the plan, is when people went back to see, well, why does this particular piece of ground have a restriction? It was because whoever looked at it decided that. And there wasn't a paper trail that you could point to prove it. But so there were flaws in it. But the idea that it was data driven and that it was justifiable and it was based on the idea of carrying capacity really became quite important in planning globally, and now is almost taken for granted. You can't really submit a development plan without an environmental impact statement. And these were basically, environmental impact statements that were done in 1971. So that was very important. But I loved, when you and I were talking on the phone earlier, you characterized the early APA plan in 1973 as, I love this phrase of yours, all brains and no heart. That it was really complicated. It was very poorly explained, and it was a cerebral exercise. It was the work of a graduate student who had seen the whole thing in his head and attempted to express it on paper. But as you correctly pointed out, successful planning efforts can't end there. They have to go to the people who are affected by the plan and also integrate, their hopes and dreams for the area. So that was what was lacking, I think.
Yeah, what was amazing to me, however, was that it did survive fairly well through the map amendment process over 30 or 40 years. Whenever a big map amendment proposal came in, and the agency did, some level of modification of it, and in a town plan where the town maneuvered the densities around so that it would average out the same as a given category. It was always amazing to me how that 9,000 square miles, or say 5,000 square miles of private land, survived those challenges as much as it did. I think what helped a lot, and this is another geeky issue here, and that is detailed soils. Detailed soils gave us a grain of capacity that went from 20 acres down to 1 or 2 acres. The details, or at least 5 acres. So you really did have a much finer grain of ability to categorize land.
Yeah,
over the
that's true.
1980s, for example. Yeah,
that's true.
And we went crazy when we got new soils information.
Oh, I bet. Yeah. And there was also an important political reason why the plan survived. And that is because, a Democrat was elected governor in 1974, Hugh Carey. He was succeeded by Mario Cuomo in 1982. And it wasn't really until Cuomo was defeated by George Pataki that the Democrats gave up the governor's seat. And the Adirondack Park Agency is entirely a creation of the governor. The governor controls the board and appoints the board. and the board reports to the governor. So whoever's
Right.
governor has a tremendous effect.
Right.
And the governor was a Democrat. And in order to appeal to the very strong, very well-organized statewide environmental community, he had to protect the APA.
Yeah, there must have been some, it's interesting because it's a part of the executive branch, but the legislators often jumped in and participated in terms of what was going on.
Yeah, they had advise and consent. It was famous. People used to say famously that nobody was appointed to the APA unless Ron Stafford let them through. And Stafford had the power. He had essentially veto power because of his personal position in the Senate.
Yeah.
But aside from that, it was pretty much a creature of the executive chamber, and that's where we are today. It reflects Andrew Cuomo's priorities right now.
Yeah, I think that some negotiation happened. Before we went on the air, as it were, I flashed a 1972 preliminary park plan map, and the difference between that and the next year is a big difference in Hamlet, especially around the Tupper Lake, around the Tri-Lakes area.
Yes.
The Hamlet areas, first of all, went to one category, just no density restriction whatsoever. Around Saranac Lake, it grew like crazy.
Yes.
And this is not news to some people, but it's news to a lot of people. I don't know why that happened, but I can imagine that the commissioners or the commissioners to be went through a lot of negotiation, had to give and take, and the Hamlet area started to grow and grow.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That is what happened. The map that's behind me right now was given to me by Bill Kissel. It's the map that was submitted to the legislature in March 1973. So the map that you have is the one that was given out to the public for public comment. And the map that I have reflects the revisions that the staff made.
That's the other one I have too. Yeah.
After public comments were received. And the Hamlet thing, from reading the minutes and talking to people in the room, most notably Peter Payne, there was a feeling among the APA board members that it was just too complicated for people to understand. And Richard Wiebe was really the guy in the room who suggested a single category of hamlets and the A and the B developments. Again and again in the minutes, Dick Wiebe comes up as the man who takes these overly complicated ideas and simplifies them and gets the board to accept something that's a little easier to understand. But still, the plan as it was passed by the legislature is still just wickedly complex, especially if you were living in a place that had little to no zoning at all before the law was passed.
Yeah, I went out to, I think I had estimated at one point 2,000 meetings in the 26 years I was there. I rarely saw the Adirondacks in the daytime, let's put it that way. When we went on the road, you had to explain the map and what it meant. So we had to do very simplified versions of the map and how it applied and how it didn't apply. And the web of jurisdiction could have been simplified as well. I'm not sure it would have been better. But the size of the A's and B's, that's all fine, but you've got to, like I did the chart, you have to do that. The whole bridge to local governments was complicated by that need to explain it. But for several, we did. And I think we did it okay. I mean, there are a lot of local planners who don't agree to that, but I think we did all right. I remember one of my favorite displays of the map was I think it's glass covered. There was a version in the bar at the Panther Mountain House in Chestertown. And I was so happy that it's not a dartboard. It was just such a relief, because only a few years in, they put the map on. Oh God, I'm going to see darts next. But it worked out okay.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to say at this point, Jim, that one of the reasons why the plan was rushed through and was sort of plopped into the laps of all of the local people who reacted so strongly to it was that Nelson Rockefeller insisted on that. There was more or less, I think there would have been a majority on the APA board to ask for a one-year extension so that the law would have been considered by the legislature in 1974 after a year of talking about it and revising it.
Yeah.
But Rockefeller said, no, no way, I'm not going to give you that. You've got to do it in 73 or you're not going to do it at all. And so that was really Rockefeller's call. Nobody knows whether or not Rockefeller had already decided to run for president, and he knew he was not going to be around, or if he had taken a look at the worsening finances of New York State government and said, I'm not going to be able to do it in 74. 74 was also a statewide election year, so it would have been far more controversial than in an off year to do this. But it was really Rockefeller's insistence that forced the plan through on such short notice.
Yeah, I also think the personalities involved, like Peter Payne, who went out of his way in uncharacteristic moments to communicate his concern about a given community or something. And when we first brought into 3 towns, I think of Hayden, Horicon, and Indian Lake, he referred to them as the 3 crown jewels. I said, "Oh my God, that's an exaggeration." But it was really a significant point. I think it was 1978. Those 3 came in with a complicated system and all that. But he was, and I think you say in your book that he was really a very good negotiator. I mean, between him and John Stock, a later commissioner, there was a real camaraderie. It was very interesting to do. I don't have others some sort of detailed questions, Amy. I don't know. You've already talked about other commissions and things. I don't know if you, Brad, I don't know if you know anything about the Oregon Land Development Commission. That was another early.
A little, I know a little bit. I'm certainly not going to take up the group's time opining about the Oregon Commission, because that's not my area. But
there were a few around the country.
Yeah.
I have a few questions that have been sent my way, so if
Good.
you can read them a few out.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm not going to get to all of them because some of them I think you guys have answered as you've been talking, but just a few that are sort of new to the scene here. Somebody would like to know, Brad, if you could address the Whitney tract pending sale and what that means for the APA.
Well, it really goes beyond the bounds of the book that I published, which ends with the signing of the law in 1973. But this does give me a chance to say that I am working on another book now that will take the political history of the Adirondacks probably into the Pataki administration. And I'm looking into the big land deals that took place during the Pataki administration and how they were done. The only thing I'll say really about the Whitney Preserve is that the state has a lot more arrows in its quiver right now to negotiate the Whitney Preserve. And really what it comes down to is whether or not there's the political will to go through with the purchase. I know the owner of the Whitney Preserve has said he won't sell it to the state. But then again, people say a lot of things to the media, and then when they actually see the deal, they sometimes change their minds. But the rise of conservation easements and other tools gives the state a lot more opportunities to protect that land in creative ways than existed in 1973.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I think it's saying it'll never sell is sort of a negotiating point.
Sunita has an interesting point. Sunita says, I love the recent news that Gabon is being paid $150 million by Norway through the UN Central African Forest Initiative for their massive carbon sequestration and preservation of its vast rainforests. How could we implement a similar model in the Adirondacks so that local towns and villages and even private landowners could financially benefit from all the carbon sequestration and ecosystem services that we have going on here? Note, I'm envisioning payments above and beyond state payment of taxes on forest preserve lands. My idea is that if we could see how ecosystem services can be monetized, we can find more common ground about land use in the Adirondacks.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. The payments for carbon sequestration is a really complicated topic And it's an area that's evolving very rapidly, but I think it possibly could happen in the Adirondacks. The only thing I will say about that, and the Gabon deal is really pretty significant, is that aside that really it's not so much whether or not the Adirondacks will economically benefit from the drive to sequester carbon by preserving large unbroken forests. It's that the Adirondacks will rise in stature as the first time that this was ever successfully accomplished by a government, certainly in North America and probably in the world.
Wow. Here's a question from Jim Townsend. He says, thank you for your question, Jim, and I don't even understand the question, so I'm eager to understand the question and the answer. One element that struck many of us who followed from afar is the A-B jurisdiction. Why was B transfer not seen as an advantage to local governments?
That's a question for Jim.
Well, I think the whole participation in it, on the one hand, the whole participation in it was seen as an endorsement of an agency that they really had a hard time getting along with, even if there was acceptance of it. The second related issue is that it's so complicated. A lot of the towns that did zoning, there was zoning here in the Tri-Lakes before the park. Tumler and Johnson, the firm, did about 8 or 10 comprehensive plans around the area. Actually, Johnson was related to Dave Johnson, the town attorney from Temple Lake. But anyway, they did a lot of that sort of comprehensive planning, but that was about as complicated as it got. So if you went into a town like Colton or went into some other place, it was they just didn't see themselves as needing that whole set of local program elements that was required to have an approved program to get the jurisdiction over Class B projects. I think that's related to Jim Townsend's question, but in other words, to pass zoning, subdivision regulation, and the sanitary code, even though they could be partially approved, you wouldn't transfer a Class B subdivision until the whole program was approved. This is a big argument we had internally. So that the complication of the law, in addition to the fact that it might not need that level of control in the first place, are two big factors in terms of why that Class B transfer didn't occur as well as it might have under a simpler law.
Yeah, and Jim, for the benefit of people like me who are still a little unclear,
Okay.
please explain in lay terms what the difference is between a Class A and a Class B project.
Okay, basically for subdivisions, the larger subdivisions, depending on the area of land, are A's. Like any subdivision or resource management, even 2 lots, it's a Class A. But in moderate intensity, I think the Class A subdivision category starts at 75 lots. So you could go from 5 to 75 lots in moderate intensity, and it'd be a Class B project. I'm just doing this with memory. But in all those categories, there was 2 levels of jurisdiction, 2 number of lots that related to that. So for any town to sort of figure out, do they want to do subdivision regulations in the first place, they saw this other thing as sort of, because when they got a Class B project, they'd have to notify the agency, which happened, and tell them the agency was still a party to that review of that Class B subdivision or project.
I see.
So that's a part of it. The other part is, I think all industrial uses are A's unless they're an industrial use area. Large commercial development above 10,000 square feet are A's, under 10,000 square feet is a B. It's on this chart. But anyway,
okay. It's
the larger things were A's and smaller things were B's. And it was a matter of explaining it all. And,
right.
And it was that didn't help in terms of what you could do.
Yes.
On the other hand, I'm not sure I would have suggested that the agency assert all jurisdiction over all land use areas except Hamlet, because that would have raised hell as well. So I'm not. Again, what we did do, interestingly enough, in some towns, we did a transfer of development rights, a TDR, which is fairly rare. Back 20 years ago, I think it was, the town of Essex or Westport, maybe one of you guys can remember. We did a transfer of development rights where you'd identify a district in a town, and the people could trade their development rights back and forth within that district until they reached the ceiling. And that development rights transfer mechanism, I think it still survived today. I'm not sure, but I think. Interestingly, one of the more advanced town plans was Arietta, which Roger Transick worked on, consultant from Cornell. Arietta had almost no land use at all, so I never could figure out how that, went about. But it was one of the more rural towns that did a lot of sort of advanced things in planning. And they
I'll
allowed
have to ask Roger.
They had no single family dwellings allowed in resource management, which was unheard of. So anyway.
All right.
Yeah. Other questions?
I have one more question here. We're heading towards an hour, and people, if you're like me, you're starting to think about dinner. But this one, I think, is maybe a little less into the weeds and a good question too. And it says, recognizing society is more litigious now in the early stages of development, how did the APA handle legal challenges to their existence?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's also beyond the scope of the book that I just published, but it's a very important part of the story, because I think that if Bob Glennon is still on the call, he knows this off the top of his head. But I think that a couple of years after the APA Act was signed in 1975 or 76, there were 9 separate lawsuits challenging the constitutionality or authority of the APA. So it pretty quickly found itself in court on all kinds of different ways. And the courts pretty much upheld the state's authority to do regional zoning in, I think, all of those decisions. The APA came out of those lawsuits pretty much with its powers intact. But that was important. The court test was very important because, as I tried to point out in the book, the nature of the work that was done was unprecedented. It had never been tried before. And not only that, the environmental laws that the work rested upon were also quite new and were still being tested in court all over the country in all kinds of ways. So the key issue legally was whether or not the restrictions in the zoning in the private land plan constituted a taking in legal terms. And if it's a taking, then the taker has to compensate the owner for the value of what's taken. And the opponents of the APA spent a lot of time and effort trying to prove that the zoning restrictions were a taking, and the courts pretty much shut them down. But it took us several years, and I don't think the last decisions came, Jim, until after you were on the APA's staff.
I think that's true. I'm not an attorney, but I believe that's true. I don't know if Bob or anyone or Paul or anybody wanted to write in about that. But that's
yeah. But yeah, it is a far more litigious society now. And that's another reason why I think things couldn't happen in the same way that they did 50 years ago. But at the same time, we've got to figure out a way to make things like this happen all over the world.
Yeah.
Interesting. And the other thing we have now is social media. So
Yes.
The resistance would have been a little bit better organized.
It would have been better organized. I think one of the reasons why the law passed without much of a fight in 1973 was that the opposition really did not have a good way to communicate and coordinate.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody in different parts of the park was sort of separate.
Mm-hmm.
I think Bob Glennon, if he's still on, I think it was Judge Breitel in the Horizon case that upheld said that the resource management wasn't a taking. I think that was the big issue.
I think that's correct, yes.
That's Paul Herman, for those who don't know. Hey, Paul.
Hello, Jim.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was wondering about
Jim Connolly.
the opposition, political opposition as of 73, because the two plans had to be approved by the legislature, and by then the towns were pretty well organized. Now, clearly, Rockefeller had a lot of power, but the earlier national park proposal got shot down pretty quickly when that was proposed. So how did they get that through the legislature, I guess is my question.
Well, the short answer, Jim, is that they did it very quickly.
In the middle of the night, yes.
No, not exactly, but it all happened really fast. Another important thing about the plan is that, the staff really was knocking itself out for 2 years. First, they knocked themselves out to produce the draft version of this plan. But then after the plan was released for public comment, they got more than 500 requests for revision in January from individuals and from governments. And each one of those requests had to be checked out. So that meant more time on the road, more all-nighters, more heavy workload for the staff. But they did get through the vast majority of those requests for revisions. And the plan that was submitted to the legislature had taken care of a lot of vehement objections. There's in the book, I uncovered some negotiation documents between the Adirondack Park Agency and Finch Prine, for example. Finch Prine wrote a letter after it got the draft version saying, we're going to take you to court and keep you in court for years and years if you don't do these specific things and change parts of our land so that we can put houses on them if we want to. So the APA essentially said, okay, and they changed the plan so that Finch Prine could put houses on parts of their land if they wanted to. And so Finch Prine said, okay, you have our blessing now. That happened over and over and over again.
I think that's like the Hamlet changes that I was talking about.
Yeah.
Matter of negotiating.
Yeah,
one more quick comment, just for, I don't know if anybody has thoughts on this at all, and then I'll let others chime in on other topics. But I was always fascinated by the history, the lengthy history of the park. When you look at when it was established in 1892, the word park didn't exist as a place that it was totally a public land. The word was used for private hunting preserves, and it didn't. And even though Yosemite had been created, it was the first, public park that ultimately became national. You didn't have the same history of the National Park Service that didn't begin until early 1918 or so, whenever that started, and so people have been confused, I think, what the word park means. They think of it as purely public space. You think of smaller parks like comparatively like Central Park, but the Adirondack Park was not established within that what we consider pristine wild land concept. It was
that's a really good point.
In public.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The word wilderness was not really defined legally until 1964, and I think it's you can argue pretty persuasively that the Adirondacks didn't really become a park in the modern sense of a place for public access that's managed for recreation until 1973.
Well, actually, I would argue that it's never been such a place, because it is public and private land.
Yeah.
It's never, not all of it is managed for public recreation, just a forest preserve is, that's it.
Yeah, but the intent of the private land plan was to preserve the idea that a visitor would see vast reaches of wide open space.
Oh yeah, no question.
That it would be a feeling of wilderness. There's a memo that George Davis wrote to the Temporary Study Commission once. George Davis was quite a good writer, and he was talking about the idea of wilderness, and he said, how do we manage for a feeling? Because what the point he was making was the idea of being in wilderness is really more of an emotional state for a human being to achieve. And that was really, what the goal of the park should be, is to give people that feeling.
Well, not only, I'm sorry, I just have to make one more comment and then I'll stop. This tension between what wildland is and wilderness, it's a legal question that's going to continue to haunt the park in the future because of this recent decision on snowmobile trails.
Hmm.
That has never been litigated, whether snowmobile trails can or shouldn't be, should or shouldn't be in the park. And that's, it's an open question that if it's ever litigated, frankly, looking at this recent decision, I think snowmobiles are gone from the park.
Wow. Okay.
I don't think, how do you avoid it? How do these large noisy machines part of a wild land? It just doesn't work.
I'll
And
leave
so-
that to others, Jim, but I will say that the environmentalist aversion to snowmobiles goes way, way, way back.
Oh,
I
yeah.
interviewed a guy named Almi Kagashal. Some of you will remember Almi Kagashal. And he said that the first time he ever heard a snowmobile in the early 60s, he just completely lost his mind. And he just ran after it saying, what the hell are you doing out here? You can't be, it's disturbing the beauty of the winter and all this kind of stuff. And he went to a meeting, he became known as an anti-snowmobile activist. He went to a meeting and somebody who sold snowmobiles came up to him after the meeting and said, Almi, do you ever say the word snowmobile without saying the word goddamn first?
Yeah, you should have heard Norm Van Valkenburg. He basically said the same thing.
Right.
He was the head of DEC's Division of Lands and Forests.
On the
Amy, I
other
think-
hand, where would Old Forge be without snowmobiles?
I think Steve Ehrman has a question.
Brad, I just want to say first, it's an interesting conversation. It's nice to be on this call.
Thank you.
I think in the clip, Liz Thorndike's comment about how little it occurred to people that they should focus on the economy was interesting.
Yeah.
And I've never, in all the years that she was on the agency and I was on the staff, I never ever heard her say that. So time, I think, and reflection, I think, has served her well, and I think served history well.
Yes.
On the comment about the nature of the park and all, in 1985, when there was the centennial for the State Forest Preserve, the comment, the moniker was coined that the Adirondack Park was a place of people and natural wonder. And in my view, if that had been 15 years earlier, if that had been the moniker placed on this whole effort, and it would have allowed people to have the reassurance that their economies, even within hamlets, were not going to be undermined by the plan, it would have been a much, much easier ride to get this plan in place. But that wasn't the case. And you were right about the exuberance of the staff, as bright as they were. Dick Lawrence, I was economic advisor to the agency for 28 years. And I came on the scene in 1982. In 1984, Dick Lawrence made the comment to me that his greatest lament, or one of his greatest laments, was that they did not focus on the economy and tried to push a more balanced program. And my comment back to him was, well, in those earlier days, you were really trying to get this land use plan in place. And he came back and said, yeah, but it would have been better if we had focused on the economy too. It would have helped us to get that plan in place.
Yeah.
And he's not around to confirm that, unfortunately. He was a great guy, but I think that comment is accurately reflected. And I think it's telling. It took about 10 or 15 years for some maturity to fall into place and to really recognize what it takes to get a plan easily adopted or more easily adopted.
Yes,
So
I think that's a good point, and Steve, and I think Liz Thorndike, I was a little unfair to her by isolating that clip for the teaser, because her views really did evolve a great deal. And when she was an APA commissioner, she really was known for being a very good listener to local people. She was really talking about when she was an environmental activist in Rochester in 1970, and the environmental movement was a new thing, and it was more or less a holy crusade, and people's views had not evolved. I think you're also right about Dick Lawrence. I unfortunately didn't get a chance to talk to him for this project. He died before I got involved, but he was very intelligent, very reflective, and he spent a great deal of time on boards of directors improving educational opportunities for people who lived inside the park. So he was acutely concerned with the welfare of people who lived inside the blue line. And I think that his position was that when he was sort of ramming through the 1973 law for the APA, he didn't really have time to do much more than he did.
Right. You know, it's interesting, Liz, it gives you a little sense of evolution, I think, when you think that it took 15 years for the agency even to clearly define what its economic role should be, what it should do and what it shouldn't do, what it should leave to the Department of Commerce at the time, now Empire State Development. But what are the responsibilities that a regulatory agency should have when it comes to the local economy and trying to improve the local economy? And when that policy, which was written, was being considered for adoption by the agency, one of the comments that Liz Thorndike made was, and there's some things after a long career and a long retirement, you still, stuff really sticks in your head. But she said, you know, it's really a shame that we can't, in this paper and in this policy, we can't use the word economic improvement instead of the word economic development, because economic development means development. And what that said to me was, you know, everybody wants to go to heaven, but they don't want to die. You know, you want to have the economy be strong, but you can't foresee how ever seeing construction on land, whether it's open space or not, would be acceptable.
Yeah.
And that was the problem with the agency, and lack of balance in its earliest years. I think people just did not want to see development, period.
Right.
You know, I think one thing your book does very well is describing how well the environmental movement was organized, and the locals were not. Of course, they were overwhelmed. It was a rising environmental time. And as to Steve's point, I don't. Would you make the argument, Steve, that the park plan and the park agency or the park plan, did it hurt the economy of the Adirondack Park?
I think the park plan, let's put it this way. I think what we as state officials needed to do was to take the long view about what was going to be best for the economy of the park and the state over the long term. And I think in the process of adopting the plan and implementing, yes, the economy was hurt. However, over the long term, I think the economy of the park is going to be so much stronger. And I think the ability of the park to be a national attraction will serve the people of New York and the people of the park very, very well. We're not at the end of this story. We're at the end of the beginning of this story, and that's really important to keep in mind. And I think that really goes to what I think the folks in the earliest days were really recognizing.
Yeah, I think the argument is that the fact that this planning document came in, it made the park a more attractive place to come to.
Right.
And now we have this global environmental issue. Now we're looking at forests who are producing oxygen. And George Davis had this idea that it was part of it. That was just not the park. It was all part of the Northeast as an environmental zone. So you're right. I think we're just at the beginning of the story.
Yeah.
Right. And all of us as people involved in it are kind of small town players. Even the big folks in this story, when you think about what's going to happen over the long term, we've all played our part, and all those battles back and forth and the gnashing of fists and all, and the fights. It's leading to a very good result in my mind. It's just painful year by year for the people who are involved.
Yeah, two things I'd add to that. One is I unfortunately forget who said this to me, but to the point of whether or not it's hurt or helped the economy, one of the most pithy things I ever heard on that question is someone who told me that it made it much harder for people to make a fast buck.
Right.
And so it basically put in place an economic model where long-term investment and commitment over a period of years was in a position to be rewarded. And somebody like the Horizon Corporation, for example, who bought 24,000 acres in Colton, subdivided 10,000 housing lots, and was going to sell those lots and get out and never be part of the Adirondacks again. They were no longer able to play in the Adirondacks. So it made it harder to make a fast buck.
And the sad story, Brad, of this really is there are a lot of small entrepreneurs and people who had ideas and wanted to get things going, and projects that were not severely negative in terms of impact. A lot of those people were held back from doing those things. And those are all, there's loads of stories like that.
Yes.
However, again, it's the long-term result, and what is the cost of getting to that end? And this was not a story that was going to play out without people being hurt in the process. And that's really been the history up to this point. And hopefully things will be better, and they'll be better, but more of a recognition that the economy and the environment can really be worked together for a good result.
I think the appreciation on the part of local officials over the years has in part come with an understanding that without resource management lands, agriculture and forestry management wouldn't exist anymore.
Right.
And it would all be second home development.
Right.
That's something that the creation of the Adirondack Park Agency is a huge success story. And I don't know how this story needs to be told, but somehow it ought to be told, because there's so much pressure to subdivide, even if you're a farmer, to get out, and because you don't have kids to pass it on to, but it allows for that potential to still be there into the future.
Right.
I'm going to jump in here, and I just want to point out that my friend Caroline raised her hand. I think she has a question. And Caroline, I think I'm going to hand it over to you to have it be the last question, because your dad is tired and ready for his dinner. So
I'm the only one.
Are you there, Caroline?
Hello, Caroline.
Thanks. Hey, hi, Brad. Hi, everyone. Hi, Steve. Hi, Jim. Hi, Paul. Yeah, I'm just, it's just interesting to think a little bit about this economic balance, because, you know, growing up here and then growing up as the kid of, I'm no longer a kid, but as the kid of someone who worked at the APA, you know, it felt, you know, there was violence in the air, right? Like you could really feel that polarity played out in very real ways. And I think, you know, even though I hear I'm an environmentalist, you know, I'm a dyed in the wool lefty, but and so the long view is always, of course, my preference. But I will say that, like, who benefited and who suffered are very different stories, right? And we try to weave that into one story, but in fact, it's not one story. So, you know, this question about whether it hurt the economy, well, whose economy, right? And when you've got a community that's so incredibly marginalized, and all of a sudden they can't sell that piece of land, you know, and they can't make it work, you know, then did you put that family into, they were, you know, marginal and potentially close to starvation, honestly.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. And a point, actually, that's a point that Andy Halloran down in the town of Minerva made to me in a very powerful and articulate way. You know, he talked about people, his neighbors in the town of Minerva who wanted to subdivide, were counting on the money from subdivision, you know, we're really just talking about 1 or 2 lots, or maybe opening a barber shop or doing something on the small scale. And because of the APA, they weren't allowed to do it. So
I
I don't think very many people shed a tear when the Horizon Corporation was chased
Right.
out of the park.
I think it's part of the myth of the Adirondacks. It was the wealthy people who was doing large subdivision. And I don't think the smaller landowners had any problems. And any local government official who espouses that knows nothing about the APA Act or how to amend a map.
Right.
Never even tried.
Yeah.
My comment only, okay?
Yeah.
You know, George Davis made a comment which was fairly well known, and I love this comment. But he said the state has always tried to have a park on the cheap,
Yeah.
and he was talking about open space preservation. That's where his priority was. However, that comment applies to
That's right.
all community development, economic development, support for local institutions, for school districts, for public services, infrastructure. The state has always tried to, and the fact, and Jim could attest to this, the fact that Jim could not, in the budget for the park agency, could not get a stronger, bigger staff for local planning assistance. You couldn't come up with $100,000, $150,000 to give assistance to communities to do local planning. And from the perspective of mine as an economic guy, you know, you couldn't come up with some really good programs for entrepreneurial development, for marketing the park as a whole as a tourist attraction, for making payments to entrepreneurs who were hurt potentially, it could be proven by the Park Agency Act, you know, really putting some money at this effort to come up with to make this park a place of people and natural wonder.
Right.
The state really has tried to do it on the cheap. And in my view, I think the state still tries to do it on the cheap. And until they figure out that this is a place that, if we're going to do something very much for the long term, really takes a lot of investment and makes those investments, you know, we're still going to see some rocky times, issue by issue.
Yeah.
Well,
You guys, thank you so much for all of your wonderful questions and comments. I knew this would be a lively bunch. And Jim and Brad, this has been fabulous.
Yeah. Great session.
Thank you so much. I know I've been seeing you're on the circuit with this book. This is not the first or last discussion. So I encourage everybody to stay tuned for more discussions that Brad will be having. And of course, for the next round of work that will be coming out, we're really excited about that.
Yeah, all of the events, all of the places and virtual and in-person stuff that I'm doing is at my site, which is awildidea.com. I'll be at the Wallensburg Grange next Tuesday night,
Awesome.
if you want your book signed.
Great. Thank you for this.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Super
Great
fun.
to talk to you all. Take care.
take care.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks, Amy.